Which language does God speak? Once upon a time, there was an African boy named Emmanuel. He was always asking questions. One day, he asked his teacher, "What language does God speak?" His teacher scratched his head and said, "I really don't know." So Emmanuel asked the land people of his village, but they did not know either. Now he became really curious. He traveled around his country and asked the land people of other villages, "What language does God speak?" But they merely shook their heads. Emmanuel was convinced that someone would know. So he began to travel to other countries. But the answer was always the same. We don't know which language God speaks. One night, exhausted by his travels, Emmanuel came to a village called Bethlehem. He tried to get a room in one of the inns, but the rooms were all filled up. So he decided to look for a cave outside the town. In the early hours of the morning, he finally found one. When he stepped inside the cave, however, he saw it was occupied by a couple and a child. When the young mother saw him, she said, "Welcome, Emmanuel. We have been expecting you." The boy was stunned. How did the woman know his name? He was even more amazed when she said, "For a long time, you have been searching the world over to discover what language God speaks. Now your journey is over. Tonight, you see with your own eyes what language God speaks. He speaks the language of love." Emmanuel's heart overflowed. He fell on his knees before the child and wept for joy. Now he knew what language God speaks. God speaks the language of love. God speaks the one language that every person of every nation of every period of history can understand. And so Emmanuel stayed a few days, helping Mary and Joseph. Then it came time to leave and tell everybody the good news about what language God speaks. God speaks the language of love. As Emmanuel walked along by himself, he began to think, if I am to tell everybody about what language God speaks, I am going to have to speak the language of love myself, because that's the only language everybody in the world understands. And so from that day on, Emmanuel began to speak the language that God speaks. He began to speak the language of love. It was then that Emmanuel made a beautiful discovery. When you speak to people in the language of love, they begin to speak it back to you. They suddenly discover how much it is, and once they make this discovery, They never go back to their old languages. And so, as Emmanuel made his way back home, you could follow his path because he left behind him a trail of towns and villages where people began to speak the language of love. Later on, when somebody told Emmanuel what had happened in the towns and villages he had passed through, he made a second great discovery. He discovered that this is what God had in mind when he gave the world his only Son. He wanted to teach the world to speak one language, the language of love. God knew that once people began to speak it, they would never go back to their old again. He knew something else. He knew that once people began to speak the language of love, wonderful things would begin to happen everywhere. Nations would begin to share their resources and talents with one another. Races would begin to treat one another with dignity. Families would begin to live together in harmony. Everywhere, people would clasp hands in friendship. Then God's promise through the prophet Isaiah would indeed come to pass. The story of true love that the Lord began in the manger found true fulfillment upon the cross. Although the crucifixion was intended to take away every vestige of a criminal's freedom and dignity, the Word of God shows us that Jesus was not an ill-fated victim. He emerges from the cross as one who is still on a mission. He was still in control, trusting in the Father and carrying out his redemptive plan. The cross does not inhibit Christ's ministry of mercy. Indeed, from there he performs the most powerful act of forgiveness one could offer, forgiving one's enemies. And when they came to the place which is called the skull, there they crucified him and the criminals, one on the right and one on the left. And Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Luke chapter 23, verse 33 to 34. The language of love.